Thank you to everyone who commented. Your words help me keep going. Radio silence. Chapter summary. In which it's a wonder Adrian hasn't died of dehydration because of all the crying. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Adrian tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest, gazing out the window and looking at the drops of rain slide down the glass. Natalie had initially refused Adrian's request to be taken to the hospital, what with the threat of Demoman and the rain pouring outside looming, but one quick call to his father imploring for his understanding had quickly solved that problem. Gabriel's eyes had even softened at his son's plea, a rare sight, and even urged Natalie to not delay Adrian's visit any longer. Adrian had hopped eagerly into the limo, urging the gorilla to step on it. Seeing that they were alone in the backseat, Tiki poked her head out of the neck of Adrian's jacket. Are we there yet? She whispered, looking around apprehensively. Almost, just a minute or two to go, he whispered back. Tiki nodded and hid back in the folds of the coat. Adrian swallowed nervously. The news playing on the screen on the dashboard in front of him kept asking for Chad Noir and Ladybug's whereabouts, noting their blatant absence and even questioning if they had both been defeated by Demoman. What made his insides squirm even more was the reporter posing the question of whether or not Ladybug had made it out of the encounter at all the while replaying the horrible clip of the battle where she was last seen. He tried to focus his mind elsewhere before he got sick again, setting his eyes on the road. They kept driving past streets that had been closed off by police, as the roads ahead had been destroyed by the Akuma. He lost count of all the shortcuts Gorilla had to take, and he tried not to think about what awaited him in the near future. With Ladybug indisposed, he'd had to fight the Akuma alone. He couldn't suppress a shudder, and he felt a comforting pat on his chest. No doubt from Tiki, Plag wasn't that empathetic. At last, the tall and gray facade of the hospital's emergency unit came into view. The limo had barely pulled up to the sidewalk when Adrian jumped out the door and rushed into the lobby, quickly dialing Aaliyah's number. A set of quick directions from Aaliyah and an elevator later, he found himself in the hallway to the waiting room. He stalled at the door, his hand lingering on the doorknob. Suddenly, he felt inadequate, like he didn't belong. Behind the door was Aaliyah, sure, but so were Marinette's parents, Tom Dupain and Sabine Cheng. Something about that realization made him get cold feet. How could he face them? What are you waiting for? Plag complained suddenly from the folds of his jacket. Go inside, Tiki is getting anxious. Is something wrong, Adrian? Tiki asked gently, popping up beside Plag. I don't know, he said. I feel like I shouldn't be here. It's in your head, kid, Plag scoffed. Get in. Her parents are in there, Adrian argued. Tiki looked at him blinking in confusion, her eyes turned sad as she seemed to realize something. Whatever that realization was though, she didn't express it and instead shook her head. Plag is right, there's nothing to worry about, Tiki said reassuringly, but Adrian, I'd like to talk to you later, if that's okay. Okay, Adrian said, raising an eyebrow questioningly. He then braced himself with an intake of breath. All right guys, hide. Both Kwame slipped under the neck of his coat and, after mustering enough courage, Adrian grabbed the doorknob and pushed the door open. What he saw was nothing short of what he expected. The small room felt depressing and heavy with tension. Light subdued by rain filtered through the only window in the room, giving it a gloomy feel. Sabine sat on a chair, her face flushed and tear-stained as she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Tom sat beside her, an arm around her petite shoulders, the other rubbing soothing circles on the top of her hand. Their eyes were glassy and red with dark rings around them, their frames hunched and tired. He found a similar expression on Aaliyah as she turned away from the window and saw him standing in the doorway. Adrian, Aaliyah said, her voice tired. Everyone turned to look at him and for a moment Adrian wished the earth would swallow him whole. He suddenly wanted to run away, break down somewhere, and just pass out to make this end. Hey, he choked. Adrian, Tom said softly, rising from his seat to greet him and smiling a little despite himself. It's nice to see you, son. Likewise, Monsieur Dupain, Adrian said politely, offering his hand as Marinette's father approached him. Tom will do, Tom replied with a chuckle, shaking Adrian's hand and patting him on the back. Adrian then turned to Marinette's mother, his heart squeezing painfully. Madame Cheng, he said inclining his head in respect. Sabine also attempted a tearful smile, reaching out to him with her arms. Come, she said gently, her voice low and weak. Adrian obeyed without hesitation, moving closer to her and kneeling before her so she wouldn't have to stand up to greet him. He gasped in surprise when she suddenly pulled him into a warm hug, softly stroking the back of his head. Thank you for coming, Adrian. We really appreciate it. I'm sure Marinette would be happy to see you, too. Adrian fought the incoming sting behind his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat as he returned the embrace. Of course, he said, his breath catching. He squeezed Sabine gently and pulled back, bowing his head again. I'm so sorry about all of this. There was no way they could know he was Chat, but he felt like apologizing anyway. Apologizing for not being good enough, for not protecting their daughter like he should have. Tom shook his head. It will be okay. She is a fighter, he said, his smile quivering. We'll get through this. Adrian didn't know how to ask. He wanted to know, but was afraid to know, afraid to acknowledge the severity of the situation. He swallowed thickly, his mouth suddenly dry. How is Marinette doing? He managed. Tom opened his mouth, but hesitated, closing it again. Sabine's chin trembled, and she looked down at her hands. I'll update him, Aaliyah interrupted, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Let's talk on the way down. Would you like something from the cafe, me, and M? Dupain Cheng. She asked Marinette's parents. We are fine, Aaliyah, thank you. Tom said, eyes softening. Go get some fresh air. Thanks for being there for Marinette. Anytime, she said with a small smile, we'll be right back. You have my number if you need anything. She hooked Adrian's arm in hers and dragged him with her as she closed the door behind them. She released his arm and they walked down the hallway, taking the elevator. She was silent the whole way down to the lobby, her eyes trained on her sneakers, but Adrian was okay with it. He didn't know what to say and he preferred to wait till Aaliyah was ready to talk before asking anything. For someone who had seen the horrid, bloodied state of her best friend, Aaliyah was holding herself pretty straight and composed. Adrian was really impressed by her fortitude. He wished he was that strong. They reached the first floor and entered the hospital's cafe, where Aaliyah promptly ordered some warm drinks for them. Adrian moved to pay, handing some euros to the cashier before Aaliyah had a chance to protest, though she seemed too exhausted to fight and gave him a soft thanks instead. She was handed the drinks and she nodded her head toward a lone table in the back of the cafe. He nodded and followed her in silence. She set the drinks down on the table, but before she had a chance to sit, Adrian grabbed her by the arm and gently pulled her towards him, wrapping his arms around her. She was unmoving for a moment, taken aback, then her shoulders sagged. She clutched at the fabric on his back almost instantly, sinking her face in his chest, her body trembling with the silent sobs she had been holding in all evening while trying to be strong for Marinette's parents. You said you could use a hug, Adrian mumbled, smiling against her head. She chuckled against his chest. I sure did. Thank you. She pulled away after a moment, wiping at her eyes, then motioned for him to sit down. He nodded but moved to pull the chair out for Aaliyah first. She sat down and he pushed her chair forward. Aaliyah made a quip about him being a gentleman even in desperate times and he smiled, seating himself across from her. Aaliyah drank quietly from her cup then put it down, her face downcast as she gathered her thoughts. Adrian reached out and placed a comforting hand on hers, rubbing the top of her hand with his thumb. He remained silent, waiting patiently for Aaliyah to speak when she was ready. He could only imagine how hard it was for her, watching her best friend, practically a sister to her, in the bloody mess she was in. He could relate, in a way, because even though he had not known Marinette as deeply as Aaliyah, he knew Ladybug. She was his trusted partner, his yang, the one he could not live without, and as Plague had aptly put it, the love of his life. It pierced his heart every time he remembered that she was somewhere in that hospital behind a cold, unfeeling door, battling for her life. How had the day turned around so badly? Aaliyah smiled a tired smile, her eyes glistening as she looked at him. Thanks for taking my call, Adrian. No problem. I know Nino is sorry he couldn't be here, Adrian replied softly, but I'm here for you and Marinette. If there's anything I can do to help. If you can make her okay, then that would be super. Aaliyah commented almost as an afterthought, but instantly regretted it as she saw the flash of pain that passed through Adrian's eyes. What I wouldn't give, Adrian mumbled, his eyes downcast. If all the money he owned were enough to save her, he'd give it away without a second thought. He turned back to her, eyes filled with dread. Aaliyah, what is going on? She is not going to, you know. We don't know, Aaliyah whispered, catching his meaning. She was, in really bad shape, Adrian. Adrian cringed, unable to hide the shudder that overtook his body. Aaliyah sighed, bracing herself to tell him everything. After taking a few steadying breaths, she began. After Aaliyah had seen Marinette being taken away in an ambulance, she immediately called Marinette's parents. The Dupain Chengs closed the shop and rushed to see their daughter straight away, their faces white with dread. When they got there, they found Marinette had been rushed to the emergency room to be stabilized, her injuries too life-threatening to wait around. Aaliyah recounted the extent of the damage to Adrian as the doctor had laid it out to them: broken ribs, collapsed lung, head split open, hip shattered, immense blood loss, a dreadfully long list of injuries so severe they couldn't fathom how she was still alive. Most incredible of all was the fact that, save for her lung, none of her organs were damaged or malfunctioning, and yet, considering the state of her body, they couldn't explain how she was still breathing. She was truly a fighter. They let us see her for a minute and then they moved her to surgery like 2 hours ago, Aaliyah croaked, clutching her cup to close her head and fix her hip end. God, it was so awful. She covered her mouth with a hand as fresh tears sprung from her eyes, her body trembling at the memory. Color had long since drained from Adrian's face, his knuckles white from squeezing his fists too hard on the table. His eyes glazed, and he could feel his frantic heartbeat in his ears. He was cold inside, his stomach tossing and turning. Marinette's parents are devastated. And it's hard, Aaliyah continued, her voice breaking, because she is my BFF, you know. And they said that even if they manage to fix her, they don't know if she will recover, because the injury on her head is so bad and even with a transfusion, she had lost so much blood. So I really don't know what will happen. None of us do. He nodded dejectedly. They stayed silent for a moment, and she sipped on her cup. Adrian grabbed his, but did not drink, too busy battling his own inner turmoil. Deciding to give Adrian some time to take it all in, Aaliyah idly looked up at the TV screen hanging above them to distract herself. It was muted, but it was displaying the local news, showing scenes of the destruction, of Demoman, of Chad Noir, and Ladybug. It's a good thing Chad Noir was there. Adrian tensed, and if it wasn't because he was still sitting upright he could have sworn his heart stopped and he toppled over. He looked at Aaliyah, glistening eyes wide. If he had not saved Marinette, I don't think she would still be here, you know. I wish I could thank him and just talk to him. About Marinette, about Ladybug. She hasn't shown up since Demoman attacked her. Do you think she is okay? I haven't exactly been able to jump back into the fray. But Adrian was not listening. His brain was short-circuiting. It's a good thing Chad Noir was there. What good he did, indeed. If he had actually been any good, Ladybug no, Marinette wouldn't be here right now, cut open and bleeding, lingering in death's threshold because he was not competent enough to keep her safe. Adrian trembled in anger, gritting his teeth. Adrian, came Aaliyah's worried voice, but it didn't register with him. He squeezed his eyes shut and ran a shaking hand through his hair, breathing heavily. He wished so badly to see her. To feel her breath on his face and her heartbeat under his hand, to feel her warm skin under his touch, her soft hair through his fingers. If anything, to cling on to any indication that she was still alive and not lying dead in a surgery room somewhere, doctors hovering over her and deliberating how to tell her family that she could not be saved. If they needed blood for her they could pump him dry for all he cared, as long as Marinette was safe. He wished he could just trade places, to be the one under the light right now. Adrian, breathe, Aaliyah said, standing up suddenly and hovering over him, eyes filled with concern. Breathe with me. His heart rate had increased, his pulse throbbing underneath his skin. It was getting increasingly hard to breathe. His eyes burned with hot tears and he could feel himself choking. Hey, I'm here, Aaliyah soothed, dragging her chair up beside him, sitting down, and pulling him into an embrace as she saw him unravel. Let it all out. And he did. He reached out and clung to her like she was a lifeline. Heart-wrenching sobs ripped from his throat as he cried against Aaliyah's shoulder, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. He completely let go of any inhibition, of any semblance he had tried to show that he was strong and composed, crushing the image of the upstanding model that he so carefully upheld. He let out the fear, the dejection, the guilt, and the sadness he had been harboring all day. His fingers clutched at the fabric of her shirt, his face completely hidden in the crook of her neck like a child. And he wished so hard that she was there. His mother, who had disappeared some time ago without a trace, who had brought warmth to his home and his heart. He wished so badly to be consoled by her, to be told that it wasn't his fault, and that everything would be okay. But she wasn't there, and things would not be okay because it had been his fault, for not fulfilling his role of protecting Ladybug at the cost of his own life. He had failed, Marinette paid the ultimate price, and it would all be on his head. And here he was, crying like a child and lamenting the loss of yet another light in his already dull, miserable life. He was consoled by a friend who had much more of a right to cry over Marinette, and who had every reason to hate him if she only knew who he was. But she held on to him, gently stroking his head, patiently rubbing his back. The cafe was mercifully empty, and the baristas had turned away, giving them the privacy they needed. If only Marinette could see us now, Aaliyah chuckled half-heartedly after Adrian had cried his fill and they had let go of each other. being so emotional over her. Especially you. Me. Adrian croaked, why me? There it was again. Singling him out. He recalled Aaliyah emphasizing that he, Adrian, should be there and he had wondered why. Marinette was warm and friendly and had plenty of friends, why was Aaliyah so adamant on having him there? She hadn't even mentioned her boyfriend, Nino. Aaliyah hesitated. She would kill me if I told you, but I guess it can't be helped. She wrung her hands nervously, in case anything happens and, if Marinette. Please, don't finish it. Adrian warned. He didn't want to hear it. Implied or otherwise. He had enough with his own dark thoughts. Aaliyah nodded and Adrian waited, wiping his tired eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, looking curiously at Aaliyah. Marinette kinda, well, not kinda, Marinette positively loves. She jumped suddenly with a squeak, a buzzing sound reaching their ears. She hurriedly reached into her pants pocket and took out her ringing phone, touching the green button and placing it against her ear. Hello, Aaliyah said. Adrian saw her give a small gasp of surprise and nod at whatever she was being told on the other end. After a minute or two of being quiet, she spoke again. Yes, we'll be right up. She put her phone back into her pocket, turning back to Adrian. Whatever she was going to tell him earlier, she completely disregarded it as she grabbed his hand. She's out. There can only be 2 people at a time, so we're in after her parents see her. Since she's in ICU, we get 10 minutes. She explained hurriedly, pulling him to his feet and dragging him out the cafe. Adrian stumbled, following her blindly and just letting her drag him to the elevator and back to the waiting room, all the while repeating the same thing over and over in his head. She was out. She survived the surgery. She was alive. Marinette was alive. Relief flooded him, and a weight he didn't know he was holding alleviated from his shoulders. She still had to recover, so it was a small but important step nonetheless. They reached the room again, finding it empty. Marinette's parents were gone, probably in for their 10-minute visit. He knew that friends were not usually allowed to visit a patient immediately after a surgery, but he assumed Tom had pitched in for them and convinced the doctor to let them in. Aaliyah took a seat, pulling out her phone to occupy herself with, probably to talk to Nino, and after a moment Adrian started to pace. The next 10 minutes passed by excruciatingly slow. He was convinced that if the floor had not been solid tiling, he would have made a hole in it by now. Aaliyah tapped her foot impatiently on the floor, scrolling rapidly down the contents on her phone. Adrian was convinced she was not really looking at whatever was in front of her, her mind miles away. He could feel Tiki's nervous fluttering against his chest, mirroring his own growing nervousness. What would he say? What would she say? Would she be confused? Would she remember what brought her to that situation in the first place? So many questions flitted in his head. A sudden creaking sound snapped him out of his thoughts and he jumped, arms shooting up defensively as the Chad in him surfaced momentarily. Realizing it was only the door on the back opening, he blinked and quickly put his fists down. He was glad Aaliyah had not seen his reaction as she stood up to greet Marinette's parents coming through the door, a doctor in tow. Adrian studied their faces carefully to determine what awaited him. Tom and Sabine looked haggard, but their faces were not quite as lined with worry as they had been earlier. The tears on Sabine's cheeks had dried, even if her eyes still looked dead and tired. Adrian couldn't quite place the emotion he was reading. What he saw there was different. It was no longer the fear of uncertainty and hopelessness. No, it was a sort of relief but with a lingering sense of dejection. There was still sadness, but it wasn't for the loss of a daughter. It was for a sort of loss but low-key in comparison to what could have been. It was resignation. Adrian didn't quite know what to make of that. Aaliyah hugged them both, asking them if they were okay. They nodded and murmured something to Aaliyah, but Adrian was not paying attention. He was looking at the black-haired doctor behind them expectantly as he jotted something on his clipboard. Once he was done, he rearranged his spectacles, shook his mustache a bit, and looked up at both Aaliyah and Adrian. These must be MLLE. Dupain Cheng's friends, correct? The doctor asked Tom. Yes, drive. Longwavy. Doctor. Longwavy nodded, placing the clipboard under his right arm and gesturing with his left to the door where they had come from. Well, if you will follow me, I will brief you on the proceedings. After Dr. Longwavy got them to clean their hands and arms, he guided them through another hallway, explaining the visitation rules as Adrian and Aaliyah listened on silently. No latex balloons and no flowers are permitted in ICU, hands must be thoroughly cleaned before entering the room, they will only be allowed 10 minutes at a time since Marinette's condition is delicate and they need to monitor her constantly, use encouraging words, even if it seems she isn't listening, keep your voices level, do not disturb her, do not touch her head or hip, do not be alarmed by the strange machines and sounds, and so on. Adrian was only half listening, nodding his head from time to time. He was growing anxious. How long was this hallway anyway? After what seemed like forever, they finally reached the room. The doctor opened it for them and let them through first. Adrian was immediately assaulted by a myriad of strange smells and sounds. Beeping and booping came and went at different intervals, soft whirring sounds were heard in the background. The smell of disinfectant and analgesic attacked his nostrils. A nurse moved around a bed in the middle of the room, looking at machines and jotting things on a clipboard methodically. It was a small room, fit for only one patient. A window was at the far back, curtains drawn closed so the light was subdued and easy on the eyes. Dr. Longwavy was saying something but Adrian was too distracted to tell what it was. He just heard the sound of the door closing and his eyes fell on the bed before him, on the inert body dressed in a pale blue robe and sunken chest deep into pristine white sheets. He walked towards her automatically, not really thinking. Aaliyah reached her first, rounding the bed so Adrian was free to linger on the side closest to him. There were tears in the corners of Aaliyah's eyes as she reached out with a hand to caress Marinette's pale cheek, and Adrian felt pain. Pure, unbridled pain. Marinette's skin was white, her cheeks flushed with sickness, and her closed eyes sunken. A tube of sorts came out of her mouth and connected to a ventilator at her side. The great majority of her head, including her left eye, was wrapped in thick, white bandages. What little hair they could see under the bandage lay sprawled over the pillow. All over her were cables and tubes connecting to her body in some way, on her arms, on her chest underneath the robe, on her temples, tethering her to all the strange monitors around her. She breathed slow and short breaths, trembling with every try, as if she was struggling to suck in even the simplest of breaths. Adrian came closer almost hesitantly, ignoring the feeling of his heart in his throat and idly tapped his chest twice with a finger. He felt the hurried flitting of a kwami moving up underneath his jacket and slinking down his right sleeve, and he subtly raised his forearm. He felt Tiki's little head underneath his palm, hiding behind his fingers as he pointed his hand to the bed so she would see. He felt her tremble. His left hand moved on its own, brushing his fingers softly against the back of her hand. She was cold to the touch. She looked like she had been to hell and back, purple and black blemishes peppering the distinct parts of skin they could see. He felt moisture building at the corners of his eyes again, but kept them at bay. "Hey, Marinette," Aaliyah whispered, her voice cracking as she laid a hand on Marinette's arm. "You did great. I'm so proud of you. You're such a fighter, girl." Marinette didn't stir, nor respond in any way, but Aaliyah kept talking encouragingly, rubbing Mary's forearm gently. Adrian looked on, his voice gone. He just watched, taking in the image of her beaten, broken body, wishing he could so much more for her than just caress her hand. "When do you think she will wake?" Aaliyah asked the nurse that had so far lingered in the back to give them privacy. "We currently cannot determine when she will be waking," the nurse said. She looked at them in such a way that made them feel like what she said was the most obvious thing in the world to know. "Depending on her recovery, it may take some time." "Why is that?" "Sedatives," Aaliyah asked, raising an eyebrow. The nurse looked at her curiously, then her eyes softened in realization. "Did drive Longwavy not brief you on MLLE? Dupain Cheng's condition?" Not really, just visitation rules." The nurse hesitated, looked over at Marinette briefly, then turned back to them, her eyes sympathetic. Adrian found himself regretting Aaliyah's question before the nurse even spoke next. MLLE. Dupain Cheng is in a coma. Chapter end notes. Edit, ARTTSSSS. http://pharisee.tumblr.com/post/1430797423336/lilyfrog slams fist on table. I need more. I apologize if there are any formatting errors. I hope I got them all.